Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Valerie Smith, president of Swarthmore College, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual McCabe Lecture, a highlight of Garnet Weekend. And I extend a special welcome to Swarthmore families and alumni attending today's presentation. In a few moments, two of our McCabe scholars will introduce to you this year's speaker, Matthew Goldstein, class of 2004, whose lecture is entitled Life Inside the Punnett Square. I know we're all looking forward to hearing his deeply personal story of love, loss, and reframed identity. But I'd like to begin with a few words about Thomas B. McCabe, for whom this lecture is named. Thomas B. McCabe, a graduate of Swarthmore's class of 1915, was chairman and CEO of Scott Paper Company, chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and public governor of the New York Stock Exchange. He believed deeply in the value of education and was widely honored for his contributions to the field. During his lifetime, he received honorary doctoral degrees from 15 colleges and universities, including Swarthmore. President Harry S. Truman awarded him the Medal of Merit for his contributions to education, business, and government. At Swarthmore, McCabe's legacy endures through his vision, foresight, and generosity. Generations of students have studied in the Thomas B. and Jeanette L. McCabe Library and enjoyed the serene beauty of the Scott Outdoor Amphitheater, a gift from Mr. McCabe. The inaugural McCabe Lecture, established in his honor, was held in 1986 and has since reflected his commitment to education and belief in the potential of young people to make their mark on the world. To further this mission, he also established the McCabe Achievement Award Scholarship Fund in 1952, which has awarded scholarships to more than 300 Swarthmore students, many of whom are here today. The McCabe Fellows now benefit from a closer affiliation with our Center for Innovation and Leadership, also known as the CIL. The CIL is the official new home for our fellows, providing them with focused support and resources to enable them to achieve new heights as a community of campus leaders. I'm delighted to introduce you to two of our current McCabe scholars. Deanna Sinclair, member of the class of 2025, is a senior pursuing a special major in neuroscience with a minor in linguistics, and she's also on the pre-med track. A regional Thomas B. McCabe scholar from Smyrna, Delaware, Deanna plays an active and dynamic role within the Swarthmore community. She has served as a neuroscience research assistant, looking at the interaction between depression and cognition. She served also as a teaching assistant for intro biology and intermediate chemistry courses, and is a former treasurer of the Swarthmore Health Society. Beyond campus, Deanna is dedicated to her local community, volunteering as an emergency department and post-operative care liaison at Nemours Children's Hospital in Wilmington, Delaware. Danica Greaser, a member of the class of 26, is a junior studying honors economics and political science. Danica is from Doylestown, Pennsylvania, and is engaged in a multi-year project aimed at improving indigenous education access in Montana, supported by the Lang Opportunity Scholarship. Passionate about promoting the democracy her parents defended as U.S. Army veterans, she is engaged with civic organizations that amplify voting efforts and legislative policy against closed primaries, with a fellow McCabe scholar, Harry Hu, also from class of 25. Excuse me. On campus, she is an active leader in the Swarthmore Indigenous Student Association, the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility, and previously served as the Student Government Vice President. Please join me in welcoming Deanna and Danica to the stage.
It is our pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Goldstein as the speaker for the 2024 Thomas B. McCabe Lecture. Dr. Goldstein is a physician, scientist, and entrepreneur whose career spans founding companies, building R&D teams, and leading the strategy and execution of preclinical research and clinical development. Previously a partner at Related Sciences, Dr. Goldstein worked for a venture creation firm focused on building a sustainable pipeline of new medicines with significant clinical and economic potential. He also spent a decade building and managing portfolio companies at Third Rock Venture, where he played a key role in developing the immunology program at Tango Therapeutics. This program became the cornerstone of Tango's multi-billion-dollar partnership with Gilead Sciences Incorporated. Additionally, Dr. Goldstein oversaw the development of Tango's lead program, which advanced to clinical trials in early 2022. As a co-founder of Neon Therapeutics, Dr. Goldstein created translational medicine and early development, guiding the company through its first clinical trial and initial public offering. Based on his extensive experience, he also serves as a board member for Genomes to People.
Currently, he lives in Boston with his wife, Maya Sack, and they're the parents to 2 daughters and 1 son. In January 2021, Matthew and Myra lost their oldest daughter, Javi, to Tay-Sachs disease. Sharing the heartbreak that only parents who lost their child could, 57 Fridays, Losing Our Daughter, Finding Our Way, details how Myra and Matthew turned their Friday night Shabbats into birthday parties for Javi after the diagnosis of the fatal neurodegenerative disease. Motivated by a desire to help other families avoid the tragedy his own experienced, they serve as board members of the National Tay-Sachs Disease and Allied Diseases Association. In 2023, Dr. Goldstein became CEO of JScreen to lead the company's efforts in providing preventative genetic testing and counseling, empowering parents with knowledge about their reproductive options and hereditary cancer risks. Before his career in proactive health management and as the founder and CEO of multiple companies, he attended Stanford University's MD, PhD program and completed his clinical training at Harvard Medical School. However, most importantly, he graduated from Swarthmore College with an honors BA in biology while playing for the varsity baseball and soccer team. Please join us in welcoming Matthew Goldstein back to Swarthmore.
Thank you, distinguished guests, President Smith, Deanna and Danica. You guys are amazing, by the way. Such a testament to the incredible student body here and a reminder of some of the amazing students that I was so fortunate to be able to grow up with during my time here. It's an honor to be here, to be back on this beautiful campus at such an incredible time of year. And obviously an honor to be able to share our story, my story with you. Maybe before I get into it, just to share about my experience with Thomas McCabe, who obviously is an incredible figure, and I'm very grateful for what he's done for the school and for this lectureship. I actually got to know Mr. McCabe before I started as a student here, more in a metaphysical way, I guess, but I was a junior in high school and touring colleges on the East Coast with my dad, and we came to Philadelphia. We started off at Penn. It was a beautiful spring day. We went on the campus tour and finished at the Quad, and it was packed. There were students out, blankets, playing Frisbee, reading music. It was awesome. And I turned to my dad. I said, "Whoa, this is so cool. This is college. Maybe a little too cool." And so it was a great tour. I was super excited. And then we got on the train, came down to Swarthmore, got off at the station. McGill Walk was out in front of us, the parish lawn, the arboretum. It was beautiful, bathed in sunlight. It looked like a painting. And we walked up McGill Walk and met the tour at the front of Parish. And the lawn was empty. There were no students. And just before the tour started, I raised my hand sort of sheepishly, and I said, where is everyone? You know, where are all the students? And the tour guide pointed to her left and said, McCabe. And I said, oh. And we walked over to McCabe and walked in the doors, and it was packed, just mobbed. You could almost hear the brains working and learning. And I turned to my dad and I said, this is my place. So very grateful for that building where I know a lot of us spend a lot of hours, and for what Mr. McCabe gave to us. So I'm going to tell you today about our story, and this is essentially our life journey, and about our daughter Javi. Javi's story is about how to love, how to grieve, and how those two things are really one and the same. It's a story about how to show up, about taking risks and adventures, and about living right on the edge between the physical world and the mystical one just beyond it. I'll tell you a few stories on the way to some information about what I'm doing right now. The first story begins in this year, 1881. With this man, Warren Tay. He was a British ophthalmologist, and he had been studying patients with unexplained and sort of ill-defined neurodegenerative disorders. And he reported to his colleagues in proceedings of the British Ophthalmological Society an observation that he had made that became a characteristic diagnostic hallmark of Tay-Sachs disease. And it was a cherry red spot, a small red spot in the back of the eye, examined by a neurologist, of an infant with a severe neurological disorder. And he later described similar changes in two siblings of the infant that he first saw. So evidence that this was an inherited disease. A few years later in 1887, an American neurologist, Bernard Sachs, described in a seminal paper profound symptoms of this neurologic disease that described the hallmarks of what we now know as Tay-Sachs. This is a quote from that paper. "Nothing abnormal was noticed until the age of 2 to 3 months, when the parents observed that the child was much more listless than children of that age. The child would ordinarily lay upon its back and was never able to change position. It never attempted any voluntary movement. The child grew steadily weaker. It ceased to take its food properly. Its bronchial tube troubles increased, and finally pneumonia set in. It died in August 1886. And the observations of Tay and Sachs became the moniker for this disease, Tay-Sachs disease. Fast forwarding a number of years to 1969, a seminal paper was published by Shintaro Okada and John O'Brien, both researchers at the University of California, San Diego. And they published this paper that described an observation of an enzyme known as Hex-A that was a critical component to the development of Tay-Sachs disease, and was observed to be decreased in activity in patients with the disease. And this observation that they made was a critical observation in explaining and understanding the pathogenesis of the disease, but more importantly was a discovery that allowed for diagnosis and the ability to assess the function of this enzyme in a diagnostic assay allowed them to identify an affected patient, but more importantly, allowed them to identify carriers of the disease. In order to have Tay-Sachs, you need 2 copies of an abnormal hexA gene. Carriers of the disease carry 1 abnormal copy, and the 1 normal copy of the gene allows the enzyme to function in a normal way, in a normal level, and to allow for normal development. The ability to test for the function of this enzyme and to identify carriers led to really the first ever public health initiative rolled out in 1971 to do mass screening for a rare inherited disease. This event took place at a synagogue outside of Baltimore. It was a community event that brought in lay leaders, community organizers, rabbis, clergy, physicians, nurses. And in this first event, over about 4 hours, they drew blood from 1,500 people, ran the samples up to a laboratory where they tested for hexA function. And for the first time, individuals could understand their risks of carrying this disease. This community health effort rolled out over the subsequent 3 decades. And we saw the number of individuals in the Jewish community born with Tay-Sachs disease reduced by 90%. It is one of the most profound public health interventions that we've seen, and really a testament to the power of a community-based action. So that's the first story. The second story takes us a little closer to the present day, to the year 2001, when we saw simultaneous publications of the draft sequencing of the human genome. These were 2 amazing efforts, one an academic-led effort called the Human Genome Project, which you may be familiar with, led by a guy named Eric Lander, and James Watson. The second was an industrial effort from a company called Celera, and that was led by a guy named Craig Venter. These were 2 incredible efforts and accomplishments of science. The reports that were published in that year in Nature and Science in total cost about $2.7 billion and were the result of approximately 10 years of work leading to that first sequencing of the human genome. And just by a point of comparison, we can sequence a genome today in less than 5 hours for less than $1,000. And in the next few years, we'll see that cost come down to the hundreds. So we've made incredible progress technologically and scientifically in being able to understand the human genome in all of its complexity. Now, the sequencing of the human genome was believed at the time that we were going to usher in a transformative era of understanding all disease and curing all disease and eliminating cancer and eliminating cardiovascular disease. And we've made tremendous strides in many of those areas, but we still have a lot to do. I think one of the most profound learnings that have come from this effort is really in our understanding of the scope of rare genetic disease or rare inherited disease, and the role that plays not only in rare diseases but also in cancers and cardiovascular disease. What is quite astounding is since the early 2000s, we've come to appreciate that there are over 10,000 rare diseases. 87% of those have a genetic or inherited component. And similarly, we know that somewhere between 5 to 10% of cancers have an inherited component as well. And as our knowledge of science and the relationship between genotype and phenotype, between genetics and how a disease presents, as that gets better and better over time, We're learning about the relationship and the impact of genetics on a whole variety of other disease areas, including cardiovascular disease, neurologic disease, autoimmune disease. So one of the biggest gifts of that whole genome sequencing effort and where we have come today is the ability to understand and identify risk for these types of illnesses. Just to give you a snapshot of some of the numbers around rare disease in particular, and many of you have probably encountered friends or family who have been affected by a rare disease. And, we call them rare diseases. These are events that don't happen very often. But when you take all of those together, this is actually a tremendous burden. And there are a tremendous number of people who are affected. So if we look across those approximately 10,000 rare diseases, over 30 million Americans are affected by those. The majority of those are infants, but there are indications that present more in adulthood. 30% of infant deaths are related to genetic factors and to these inherited genetic factors in many cases. We have made incredible strides in new therapeutics for a number of these rare diseases, including gene therapies, which have the potential to be transformative. These therapies are exceptionally expensive. And right now there are some therapies out there for diseases like sickle cell or muscular dystrophy. A single child costs about $2 million to treat with those therapies. So tremendous potential and huge cost, obviously. And overall, the financial burden to the medical system of rare disease is about $400 billion in direct medical costs. It's actually more than we spend on diabetes, on cancer, on cardiovascular disease, on Alzheimer's disease. So the scope of this population is immense. So I'll take you to the third story, which is my story or our story. And this, for the sake of time, I won't go all the way back to the beginning, but we'll start in 2004 when I graduated from this prestigious institution and had that amazing graduation day sitting in the Scott Arboretum. As Deanna and Donica said, I majored in biology and minored in history and religion. I played varsity baseball all 4 years. Though we weren't particularly good, it was an incredible, incredible time and a fun ride. And after graduation, I was fortunate to head back to the West Coast where I grew up and start my MD PhD at Stanford. I studied cancer immunotherapy, the intersection between the immune system and cancer, and in particular, how we could use the immune system to fight cancer through vaccines or cell-based therapies. I think most importantly, in 2006, at the end of my first year, I met the woman that I would eventually marry, who's sitting in the front row. She was the teammate of my younger sister at Dartmouth College. And when we moved my younger sister into campus, I saw Myra for the first time and was like immediately taken. Now, it took me a long time to get a first date with her, so I was kind of playing the long game. But obviously, it eventually worked out. I finished at Stanford in 2012 and made the questionable choice to leave this for this, which this was actually the first winter in Boston when we had record snowfall of over 150 inches or whatever it was, which was horrifying. But it was an incredible opportunity to come to Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital to pursue my clinical training. And the plan was to be a professor, to see patients and run a lab and teach. They call that the triple threat, which I always thought was a curious term. But I ended up getting introduced to a small venture capital group called Third Rock Ventures that builds companies, and they were really interested in building a cancer vaccine company. And so instead of moonlighting at the VA, I moonlighted with Third Rock, and we built what became Neon Therapeutics, which was a cancer vaccine company focused on making personalized vaccines for individuals based on their genetics, based on the genetics of their tumor, and the idea that we could create a custom tailored therapy that was unique to that individual and to that individual's tumor. So a real sort of beautiful use case for the power of sequencing. I spent about 5 years at Neon Therapeutics and went back to Third Rock Ventures to help build another company called Tango Therapeutics that was also in the cancer space, and also developing personalized therapy based on cancer genetics with a concept called synthetic lethality, which I won't get too deep into the science, but is a fascinating therapeutic strategy. And in the spirit of long games, I was most fortunate to ultimately marry Myra September 4th of 2016. We got married at a family camp up in Vermont, just a few minutes away from Hanover and Dartmouth, where we first met. And about a year after that, she woke me up at 4 a.m, poked me in the shoulder and said, Emmy, look. And as you can see, some of you may not be familiar with what this is yet, which is fine. This is an actual pregnancy test, and you can see the double lines. There's all different flavors of how this shows up, obviously, but this is the actual pregnancy test, and we were pregnant with our first child. And 2 years to the day that we were married, September 4th, 2018, Javi was born. And our world was transformed. It was bigger and better and sacred and beautiful. And Hav developed normally for about a year. I think most parents are biased, but she was beautiful and strong and had the most incredible laugh and smile. These are a few snapshots from that first year. And just so you can get a sense of her,
Your aunt?
here's a couple short videos.
Aunt Luda? Can you say, hi, I love you and I'm so happy for you? You can say it. Hav, you can say it, sweets. You say, I'm so happy for you? Munchkie? She's trying. I'm so happy for you? Okay, I think that's as good as it's gonna get.
So we were in love with this amazing, amazing being who came into our life and expanded our love bubble in the most incredible way. We took her to her 12-month appointment, her 1-year appointment, and the pediatrician said to us, I'm a little worried about a few things. I'm sure it's going to be fine. She's beautiful, she's strong, but I just want to, keep a closer eye on her. She's a little delayed in a few milestones, and we've got these amazing programs in Massachusetts for early intervention to help kids like her. with their development. And we were obviously deeply concerned, and in our type A tendency, before we even got home from that visit, had made phone calls to the early intervention office and to a few other resources. And over the next few months, had Javi in like 2-a-days. We were doing early intervention in the morning, physical therapy, occupational therapy in the afternoon, just convinced that we could solve this, that we could get her up to speed. And we saw a few other specialists. We saw a neurologist at Boston Children's, a fantastic institution. We came into the office room, and Hav was giggling, and he was smitten. He was totally taken with her, and he said, "I've seen thousands of kids with devastating diseases, and Javi is not one of them." And she fooled him too. We saw orthopedics, same thing. Hav is going to be fine. And ultimately, shortly after Thanksgiving in 2019, Hav was about 14 months at this point. We got the devastating diagnosis that Javi had cerebral palsy, which didn't make a whole lot of sense because the pregnancy and the birth was totally normal, and cerebral palsy is usually associated with some birth trauma or pregnancy difficulty. And the physician said, well, there are increasingly rare cases of cerebral palsy that have a genetics component, so I'd like you to go see a genetic specialist at Boston Children's, a neurodevelopmental specialist. So about a week later, we went in to see a physician named Dr. Sid, and Dr. Sid did an exam of Hav and said to us, I see some things that are concerning for Tay-Sachs disease. And we almost laughed because we had both undergone carrier screening prior to getting pregnant. And he said, well, I'd like to order some tests. I'd like to have her checked. And we got an MRI. She had an MRI of her brain. We had some blood tests set up as well. And on December 17th, I went back to the hospital to pick up a test kit from him. I pushed the button on the elevator. The mechanical hum took me up to the 11th floor. I walked to the nurse's station and said, I'm here to pick up a test kit from Dr. Sid for my daughter, Javi. The nurse picked up the phone, punched a few numbers, and said he'll be right out. I looked around the waiting room at all these kids sitting with their parents, each one diagnosis out of my med school textbooks. And then Dr. Sid appeared and extended his hand, and I exchanged pleasantries, and he said, can you come back to my office? Things got blurry at that point, and we sat down. He turned his computer screen to me and pointed to MRI images of Javi's brain and said, here, here, here. These lesions are characteristic for Tay-Sachs disease. I'm so sorry, Javi has Tay-Sachs. I'm not sure how I made it home, but I did. I walked in and walked upstairs into our bedroom. Myra was on the phone, and she dropped the phone the moment she saw my face. And I said, I talked to Dr. Sid. He showed me Javi's MRI, and she has Tay-Sachs. And Myra screamed. December 17th is diagnosis day. And that day we learned that Javi was going to die from this fatal illness, Tay-Sachs. Myra was 11 weeks pregnant with our second daughter, Kaya. So the next day we were in high-risk OB. Myra had a CVS, which is sort of like an amniocentesis, to test the fetus. Kaya, who's now 4, is a carrier. She has my mutation, but is unaffected. And just a brief interlude into science, because I can't help myself, but to take you back to 9th grade biology. The Punnett Square is the prototypic way we think about genetic inheritance. A child inherits 2 copies of each gene. One copy is from the father, one copy is from the mother. Tay-Sachs is an autosomal recessive disease. It means that you need a copy from each. You need an abnormal copy from each for the disease to present. And this Punnett Square, this 2x2 square, is a representation of that. The capital H being the dominant allele and the lowercase h being the recessive allele. It is known in the Jewish population that there's a higher rate of some inherited diseases like Tay-Sachs. And in 2017, before we got pregnant, Myra and I both got tested. And Myra was reported as a carrier, and I was reported as not. And so what we thought was happening was the Punnett Square on the left, when in reality, what the situation we were in was the Punnett Square on the right. We had Hav for another 13 months. She died in January of 2020. This moment of diagnosis was transfiguring for us. This is a particularly beautiful quote from a Celtic mystic that we have come to love named John O'Donohue. And he talks about this as that it takes only a couple seconds for a life to change. Suddenly you stand on completely strange ground and a new course of life has to be embraced. You look back at the life you have lived up to a few hours before and it suddenly seems so far away, and everything that was once steady, so reliable, must find a new way of unfolding. So after that diagnosis, Myra and I were faced with a choice. We actually shortly after that sat down with a physician who is incredible researcher and clinical scientist on neurodegenerative diseases, and ran a few trials for kids like Javi. And he said to us, well, you have a choice now. You can do everything, all the interventions, all the medical treatments, feeding tubes, eye exams, exploration of clinical trials, or you can do nothing. To this point, I had been a physician scientist trying to develop new medicines. That was my thing, trying to enroll patients on clinical trials for life-saving medications. But we were in a different space at this point, and I wasn't the physician on the other side. I was the parent. I was the patient. And so what we did was we sat down with Hav. She was just over 15 months. She never spoke a word, but we listened to her so closely. And it sounds a little woo-woo, but she made it really clear what she wanted. She knew what she wanted. She talked in the way she looked at you and the way she moved her head in response to a touch. And we asked her what she wanted to do. And it was clear for a kid like Hav, who hated the hospital, who had an exaggerated startle reflex due to her disease, that was not the path she wanted to go down. And so we chose to do everything, but in a different way. And what we did was we celebrated the shit out of her, to use the term that Myra wrote in the book. We turned Fridays into what we called she-birthdays. We knew she wouldn't have as many birthdays as she deserved, and so we celebrated one every week with friends and family and wine and food and lots of tears and lots of laughter, and faced right into the most difficult thing. And we traveled with her. We took her to the ocean and to the mountains and to the beautiful places. And that time transformed our life and transformed her life. On January 20th, 2021 at 9:04, a Wednesday morning, Hav died in our bed, in our arms. She was just shy of 2.5. Grief is transfiguring, but it's also an incredibly powerful, energetic force. And after Hav's death, both Myra and I have transformed our lives in terms of what we do. And I think in many ways have found vocation, which is something that I feel like I first started to learn about here, where your gifts and the world's needs meet, where personal and professional blend into the space that is a calling. We wrote a book, Myra wrote a book mostly, called 57 Fridays. We had 57 Fridays with Javi, and there are signed copies out in front for everyone to take. I'm biased, but it's a beautiful, beautiful book. Myra started an incredible organization called Emotion that is focused on community movement and ritual as a way to support people dealing with grief and loss. And I joined this organization, JScreen, to try and change the way we use preventive genetics, and to try and right the wrong that the physician who ordered my test ordered the wrong test. And in a day like today, with the knowledge and capability that we have, and especially in a city like Boston, but really anywhere, this shouldn't be the case. So I'll tell you a little bit about JScreen. We're a national nonprofit. We're focused on bringing preventive genetic testing to everyone, everywhere. And as I dug into how this mistake could have happened, how this error could have happened, it became abundantly clear that we are just shockingly underutilizing preventive genetics. And it may not be a surprise to many of you. We do a lot of stuff in medicine focused on treatment, focused on heroic treatments. And those are important. Those are critical, and they're impactful in many ways. But we have powerful, powerful preventive tools that can prevent those types of diseases from ever occurring in the first place. So JScreen right now focuses on two types of testing, reproductive carrier screening and hereditary cancer screening. Just to highlight some facts about the problem that we have, less than 50% of couples undergo reproductive carrier screening today. We can test for the presence of hundreds of diseases and can identify couples who are at risk for passing those diseases on to their children. But most people don't get tested. Most couples don't get tested. And maybe even worse, we do most of those tests, over 85%, when people are already pregnant. So the horse has left the barn, as they say. And there are myriad reasons why that's the case, but we can do a lot better. And on the cancer side, as I'm sure many in this room know, cancer is a huge problem. It affects a tremendous number of people. There's almost 2 million diagnoses of cancer in the United States every year, and many of those are late stage. Many of those are when the disease has progressed and is advanced and refractory to treatment. And approximately 10% of all cancers, as I mentioned before, are due to inherited mutations like the BRCA gene. And we can identify those risks early on, and we can do things to mitigate that risk through screening, through surgery, through treatment with medicines. And we really don't use that capability and that technology. So our mission at JScreen is really to deliver world-class preventive genetic care to every adult in the United States, and to make this something that is standard and part of the normal healthcare arc for individuals. As I said, we're focused on carrier screening and cancer screening today, but the hope is to expand this out to other areas. And I think we could live in a world where kids aren't born with rare inherited disease. We could live in a world where people aren't showing up with stage 4 cancer because we are taking steps to mitigate those risks. We're not going to get there tomorrow, but we have the tools and the capability to make a huge dent in that. And my hope is that through this work, we're able to get there. So I'll just finish with obviously a tribute to Hav. This little person has had such an incredibly outsized impact on our life, on our family's life, and with great gratitude on hopefully your lives as well. And I think she has taught us and changed the way we look at how we live on this earth and what we do with the gifts that we've been given, and the communities that we're so fortunate to have. So obviously this is dedicated to her. So with that, thank you guys for indulging me in the life story, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you. That was just hopeful and heartbreaking, so that was really great. Thank you. So I'm wondering what strategies you have to get everyone tested. So I'm an OB-GYN, and we have a hard time testing adults. Every kid that's born gets a newborn screen anyway, and kids tend to be funded, especially underprivileged kids, in a way that underprivileged adults don't. So do you have a strategy? What strategies do you have in mind to universally test?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think in the future, it could be a thing like you get your driver's license and you spit in a tube and you have a QR code on your driver's license. There's a lot of strong feelings about that kind of world, but I could imagine that being something that we see in the future, and we could do that. The capability to do that is there, obviously, but I think for the here and now and where we are today, I think it's a sort of multi-pronged strategy. And we take some pages out of the history book from what we saw being so effective in the early 1970s and the subsequent decades with this community-based effort. And obviously, education across the medical establishment, reframing the systems for how we deliver care, recommendations and changes in the guideline infrastructure. Insurance reimbursement is always a fun one to play with, and obviously has huge implications on how tools and technologies are utilized or not. But I think just to come back to the community-based piece, because I think it is something that is so important across many aspects of our life and our society now, is what we saw in the 1970s, starting with the Jewish community in Tay-Sachs, was the most incredible demonstration of the power of community in taking care of health. And when you look at countries that have effective preventive health measures, many of those measures are effective not because of media campaigns, not because physicians are promoting them or pushing them forward, but because they have become woven into the fabric of how that society operates. And I think that we can leverage the power of community, of tight connections, of interactions with clergy and lay leaders and educators and community organizations. And that is what was effective in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s with Tay-Sachs screening. And I think it can be effective today. In some ways, I feel like we've lost sight a little bit of the power of community in taking care of ourselves. And that is one core tenet of JScreen, is that we work on a highly local, community-based level, in addition to all those other channels that I mentioned.
Great talk, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have the copy. As I'm a MD, PhD hematologist oncologist like you, and my work is primarily in, we work with Johns Hopkins now in terms of how do we pay for to $2 million for sickle cell, say. And what we think currently in the work that we've been doing, and we're trying to work with the federal government to do that, the $2 million actually is not too expensive a price when we think about the big picture. If we can take a sickle cell disease child at, say, 8 or 10, and make that child sickle cell free for the rest of their life, we're actually probably saving about $2 million in healthcare costs. And so, well, you know, at the end of the day, we want to save the child. We'd love to have it at a lower cost, but we want to have Medicaid pay for it for all the children currently that need it, because it actually is not a disadvantage. And the second point I want to make real quickly is I got your book. I spent 6 years writing my book, taking on Big Pharma, but it's hard to get the books out. My book is, I give it out all the place, everywhere I go. I carry 1 million copies and I sign them off. And I'm hoping that you'll find a way to dispense your book, because we need it, just like I'm trying like crazy to get my book out. And my end game is having the movie made. Maybe that's your end game as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it is hard to get a book out, and it's like it's a labor of love, obviously, in many ways. And for us, it's a way to get Hov's story out there, and to be her parent in a way that we don't in the traditional sense. And just on your comment on gene therapy and the opportunity, like, I totally agree. We have to continue to move the development of these novel therapies, even at high cost, forward. And the hope is that eventually those costs come down as we improve on the cost of goods, on manufacturing, and you know, we move obviously to make things more efficient in how we develop them. But you know, it costs about $300 to do an expanded carrier screen to test for hundreds of diseases, including sickle cell. And that's not a lot of money. And even when you take into account the procedures or processes that would follow that, so IVF, if you're a carrier couple, and I failed to mention this, but we have a third child. His name is Ezra. He's 2. He is a total kick, and we used IVF and a technology called PGT, or pre-implantation genetic testing, for him. And what they do with this technology, which is so cool, is they take a sperm and egg, they fertilize an embryo, they let it grow up to about 100 cells, and then they take a sample of a few cells out of the embryo, and they test those cells for the presence of the mutation or the variant of concern. And in Ezra's case, Tay-Sachs is gone from his lineage. He doesn't carry either mutation. Doesn't carry Myers mutation, doesn't carry my mutation. So should he decide to have kids with someone who's not a carrier, Tay-Sachs is gone. It is no longer there. That is an unbelievable thing that we can do with technology that we have today. And so I think I agree with what you're saying in terms of pushing therapies forward and the impact that those have on those kids and those families, most importantly. And they're often, you can make a cost argument for them. But I think where we need to look to in the future is changing the way we think about these things, and using the capabilities that we have to transform lives in a truly profound and maybe forever way. Whichever you want, you go ahead. Oh.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I want to know, just as somebody who's experienced this, what would you say to parents who get tested and find out that they're at risk for Tay-Sachs or sickle cell in a child, especially given that we're in a situation where reproductive health care is so politically fraught and inaccessible in some places? What would you say to those parents?
In terms of, say more, it's a great question. I just want to make sure I'm seeing where you want me to go.
I think just like what would their options be? What are their, how do they cope, not only medically, but like emotionally through that process? Yeah,
it's a great question. So maybe first, like, just to address like what the options are. So if you are a carrier couple, you can obviously choose to adopt, to not have children. You can choose to use something like IVF and PGT, like we did with Ezra. You can also choose to conceive naturally, knowing that there's a risk, and in that case, you would likely undergo an amniocentesis or a chorionic villus sampling, sometime between 9 and 13 weeks. And you can determine whether the fetus is affected. And obviously there's lots of politically fraught things that come up with the choice you have to make at that point. I think the one thing that comes up a lot is, people say, well, I don't want to know. Like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know if I carry a cancer risk variant. I don't want to know if we're at risk for having a child with a disease like Tay-Sachs. I would rather just go about living my life. And my answer to that from our experience, there's really not much that I regret about Javi's life and our time with her. I think we lived it so fully and so presently and so powerfully, and we opened ourselves up to being transformed in the most profound ways. I will say the one thing that I wish I could change is how we lived the first year of her life. Because we lived the first year of her life like it was an ordinary year. And that was a beautiful year. It was the first year that we had a child. But we lived it like it was an ordinary year, and we should have lived it like it was an extraordinary year. And knowledge allows you to do that. And I think that we as a society are afraid of hard things. We're afraid of hard knowledge because it hurts, because it's painful, because it makes us sad. And I think that those things are true, those feelings are real. But I think we've learned from our experience that, like, living into that pain and living into that sadness and into that tragedy, like, is that difficult? Of course it is. But it also brings along an opportunity to experience tremendous joy and tremendous love on a scope and a scale that may not be accessible otherwise. And those two things, maybe paradoxically, but those two things coexist, and they coexist beautifully and intensely. And that's my answer to the knowledge question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My daughter has cystic fibrosis, and she's also become a genetic counselor and is trying to develop a PhD program for genetic counselors at University of Pennsylvania. And I have to say that your moment of diagnosis, as you presented it, returned me immediately to 40-some years ago when I got the call that said my 2-year-old daughter had a 50% chance of living to age 15. The total blackness that I experienced for 30 minutes I just returned to completely through your experience. And I just have incredible feeling of sympathy and empathy for what your family went through, and the incredible courage it took to handle your child's condition in the way that you did. You celebrated her life in a way that was beautiful for her and beautiful for your family. And I want to say my daughter, who's now in her 40s and has benefited from many advances in science, and would say to us pretty directly, I'm glad that my parents didn't have access to genetic testing, because maybe I wouldn't have been. So, it's a completely different situation when you're pregnant than when you're planning to get pregnant. And I think your program for getting everybody tested up front and to have the knowledge before you conceive or before you start down one of those different channels is really important. But the one fundamental thing that's come out of my daughter's life that I would like people to know about is that, and it has a lot in common with what you decided to do with your family, is she decided at age 2 that she would never be an instance of her disease. And it was wonderful that we didn't know for 2 years, because she got to develop as an ordinary child and to have the expectations of life that a child would have. And through some brilliant work by her mother, I think, in terms of working with people at her daycare center and her friends parents, she never had to experience people thinking of her as an instance of a disease. And that, if you have the unfortunate result that you do have a child have a disease, whether it's genetic or otherwise, I think that's the fundamental thing that you have to do, and that you did so brilliantly in celebrating those 57, 59 Fridays. What a wonderful idea. So what a moving presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy with the work that you decided to carry this forward into. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And your daughter sounds amazing. I would love to meet her. And maybe just a short anecdote is that to like the last point that you made, it's easy to feel like an alien in the world when you learn information like this, when you get a diagnosis like this. It's easy to feel totally outside of the normal flow of the world you used to exist in so seamlessly and easily. And that is a really, really hard thing. And especially when it's directed at your child, when it's directed at this little being. And there was a moment we got introduced, shortly after Hobbs' diagnosis, we got introduced to an amazing couple who is about 15 years our senior, who just serendipitously lived 12 minutes away and had lost a daughter to Tay-Sachs 20 years before. They invited us to come over to their house. It was a cold winter day in Boston, as all days are in Boston. And we walked in, they had a fire going, they opened the front door, and the first thing they did was they scooped Hav up, and they kissed her, and they held her like she was a queen. And it was the most amazing thing. And they are some of our closest friends to date. And that, like, as a lesson, embracing that as a friend, as a family member, as a stranger, like, that has such profound effects on a person who is dealing with something like that. So thank you for those comments, and I truly would love to meet her, so afterwards at some point, it would be great to connect. Okay, one last question.
First of all, very moving presentation. Thank you. I think my question is probably somewhat of a naive science question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I think all of us, we might not have known it was called the Punnett Square, but we've all seen it before. And I was wondering if there's been any technology that would perhaps I've always been struck that the Punnett Square is a 2x2 where the squares are all the same size, where perhaps there are technologies out there, maybe as yet to be discovered, that would repress the recessive alleles, the mutations, that would perhaps change the size of those boxes. And was just wondering if that is even remotely possible at this stage in your experience.
Yeah, I love that question. And such a cool way of like integrating the Punnett Square, this like very sort of archaic, basic thing. I think there's maybe a few ways to answer that question. One is CRISPR technology, which you may be familiar with, and that's this technology that's developed really over the last like decade or so that allows us to actually edit DNA. And we can remove genes, we can change part of the DNA code using this technology. And we are just starting to see these kinds of capabilities being used in patients as opposed to on tissues outside of the body. For example, it's being used in cell therapies to modify a patient's cells outside in a lab and then to reinfuse those cells. In the context of bone marrow transplant, we're starting to see some CRISPR technology being implemented where you modify the bone marrow outside the body and reintroduce it. And we're just at the beginning of being able to use some of that capability actually in an active patient. And one of the exciting areas of therapies like that sort of coming together with the power of sequencing capability is actually starting to test the fetus using a blood sample early on in a pregnancy where there's a little bit of fetal DNA that's circulating in the blood. There's very rare but fetal cells that are circulating in the mother's blood. You can take a blood sample out, you can isolate that DNA or those cells, and then you can sequence those to actually determine what the genome of the fetus looks like. The power of that is that you can identify spontaneous mutations, things that aren't necessarily inherited. And then you can obviously go steps down the road to then being able to perform intrauterine therapies. And there are therapies that we do use in utero already. So the technology, the capability is there, but you can see a future where we can test, diagnose, and correct before the child is even born. And that's important because a lot of these diseases have effects during development and they don't just begin when the child is born. They obviously, the pathogenesis of the disease, the biology starts to work very early on. So I think it's a fantastic question, and hopefully that's in our future at some point. All right.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. Unfortunately, when you're speaking up here, you're blinded by the lights a bit. As we sat from the side, however, we could tell just how touching this McCabe lecture series has been. As tears have fallen about the heartbreak of Javi and laughs have been shared about our most beloved studying places on campus. To the students, loved ones of students, and alumni, thank you for joining us and learning of Matthew and Myra's incredible work. Happy Garnet Weekend.